Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 440th episode, we have a bunch of news, including 2 new ankylosaur papers, what they sounded like, as well as how one ankylosaur died from a paleopathology.
Ooh.
We also have a dinosaur connection challenge, all about the different ways people have worn dinosaurs as jewelry over the years.
Very cool.
We have Dinosaur of the Day, Saurolophus, and of course, a fun fact. But before we get into all of that, we have some patrons that we would like to thank, and they are Gabe, Wayne, Mary, Scott, Eric, John, Othnelia, T-Bear, Brooke, and James Pasco.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a Dino-Know-It-All and being a part of our community. I say this every week, but we really do appreciate all of our patrons.
It's worth repeating.
Yes.
Jumping into the news, I'm going to kick it off with this paper that you may have seen already. It's about an ankylosaur larynx.
Oh, yeah. And the sounds. We've been sitting on this one for a little while.
We have. I was kind of expecting there to be a little bit more of a pushback on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was secretly sort of waiting to see if there was a response paper or anything like that announced, but I still haven't really seen anything.
Yeah, there might be later.
Yeah, it's only been a couple months, but it felt like we should get to it. People are probably wondering about it. This paper was written by Junki Yoshida and others and published in Nature, and the specific paper is open access if you want to see the pretty pictures.
Great.
So one of the hardest things to figure out with dinosaurs is what they sounded like.
Yeah, colors and sounds.
Although we're starting to figure out colors.
We are. Oh, behaviors also. There are a lot of things that are hard to figure out.
Yeah, but sounds don't fossilize, really.
True.
It's an especially tricky one. There is a famous paper from the 90s about how Parasaurolophus may have used its crest as a resonating chamber to make a low-frequency rumble, kind of like a trombone.
Mm.
We talk about that fairly often because it's one of the few examples of a actual model for what dinosaurs sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
But even that one has some pretty huge error bars and assumptions in it.
Yep.
And in my opinion, probably isn't really particularly similar to what the animal actually sounded like.
But we have no way of knowing.
Exactly. Part of that is because it's not just the head crest, even if the sound was going through that would make the sound. It's also the trachea, if there's any sort of vocalization happening in the throat. There could also be things happening in the mouth, like the tongue moving. All sorts of different things affect how you sound.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, that paper was 25 years ago, and there hasn't been much about non-avian dinosaur sounds since then.
That's true. Every time I'm thinking of examples, I think Parasaurolophus, and then I hesitate.
Yep. There are a couple. I think there was a syrinx from an enantiornithine, or maybe it was a different, like, really late Cretaceous bird, true bird, that had a syrinx, which is the vocal apparatus of a bird, which was fossilized, but that's not really a non-avian dinosaur. A lot of people make assumptions based on close relatives to dinosaurs.
Yeah, we do that for a lot of things.
Yes, because if something didn't fossilize, the best thing you can do is look at something that we think is similar, and what does it do today?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about sound, you can have stuff like booming that emus do, and ostriches. It's a little bit terrifying. They sort of like inflate their neck and other air sacs. It's like a subwoofer boom kind of thing. And then there's also growling that crocodiles do. Some other animals also hiss that are similar.
Chirp. One of my favorite hypotheses or ideas is that T-Rex chirped.
Yeah, but the chirping is a little bit farther removed from the growling and booming because you need that syrinx to do that. And we don't know exactly when that evolved. But as far as fossilized evidence goes, the very fragile bones or sometimes even cartilage that make up these vocalization apparatuses are basically non-existent in the non-avian dinosaur fossil record.
Mm-hmm.
But that has changed with the report of an ankylosaur larynx. It's not completely unexpected because land-living vertebrates basically all have a larynx, including modern birds and crocodiles.
And humans.
Yes, we are land-living vertebrates. Not particularly relevant to the bird comparison, dinosaur comparison, but yes. The interesting thing is, even though birds have a larynx, it isn't used for making sounds.
What else could it be used for?
So in addition to being used for sounds in humans, In other animals, it can also be used to protect the windpipe, and it can also help with breathing and keeping food out of the throat by sort of closing and opening. Birds probably still enjoy those benefits, but they don't need to make sounds with their larynx because they have the syrinx, like I mentioned, that can do that. The special thing about the syrinx is that instead of being high on the windpipe like a larynx, the syrinx is actually located before the branches of each lung join together. So they basically have a separate larynx for each lung. You can think of it like that. It's actually a different physical structure that isn't that much like a larynx, but just to simplify things, you can think of it as like an extra pair of these vocalization organs, one for each lungs. And that means that since they have these separate sound-producing organs on each lung, some birds can simultaneously make two different sounds at once using each lung separately to make different noises.
So birds breathe more efficiently and make sounds more efficiently?
Yeah, and can be way more complicated.
Yeah.
You've probably seen like that lyre bird that can imitate like any sound that it hears, like photography or chainsaws or whatever. It can make those sounds. It's really amazing. Fortunately for us, a team found a Pinacosaurus in 2005 in Mongolia, which includes this fossilized larynx.
And that's an ankylosaurid?
It is. Pinacosaurus was our dinosaur of the day back in episode 378, and it's an ankylosaurid ankylosaur, which means that it has that club tail. It's estimated to be about 16 feet or 5 meters long and weigh up to 2 tons. The adults had skulls that were longer than they were wide. They have a bit of a pointy snout for an ankylosaur, but the name isn't related to the Pinocchio-like nature of it. Its name actually means plank lizard, and it refers to the armor. There's a quick refresher on Pinacosaurus. This one is a juvenile specimen, and it contains the oldest larynx in the fossil record.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think so too. The previous record is also a dinosaur, although an avian dinosaur. It's a bird from about 50 million years ago. And this Pinacosaurus is somewhere between 72 to 84 million years ago. So like 50% older, if you're counting back from today. The larynx was preserved articulated very close to how it was when it was alive.
Oh, good. Makes it easier to figure out things.
Yeah, reassemble and everything. It's probably also a big part of why they found so many of these small bones, because they weren't scattered all over the place. They graphed the Pinacosaurus larynx measurements against turtles, lizards, crocodiles, and songbirds in multiple ways to try to make comparisons and see which one it might be the most similar to when it was alive. The comparisons they published all make it look like the larynx is more similar to a bird than to the other groups. And I say the ones they published because there's always as many different comparisons as you want to try to make you can come up with. However, 3 out of the 4 graphs have Pinacosaurus as an outlier or nearly an outlier in the data.
So that shows it isn't that close to the turtles and the lizards and the crocodiles.
Or even the birds. Because, in other words, it's like if you have all those different groups, it's closest to the birds, but it's not really very similar to the birds. It's like if you have like a Venn diagram, it's sort of like out on the edge of one of the Venn diagrams, or maybe even outside the bubble, but it's like close to that bubble.
So that means we have a very vague idea, but we don't really know then what it sounds like because you can't directly compare to any particular bird.
Yes. And on top of that, the thing that we can confidently say from the bones is that they probably didn't use their larynx as a sound source like we do. That's based on the larynx proportions. And the authors say it, quote, probably worked as a sound modifier like birds.
Interesting. So they were using their larynx for something else.
Yeah, and maybe like a sound modifier. So basically you could think of it as in like stopping and starting the sound might be something the larynx could do, but it wasn't vibrating to make sound like our larynx does. They also basically assume that there was a bird-like syrinx behind the larynx, but unfortunately there is no fossilized evidence of there being an actual syrinx in this specific Pinacosaurus.
Maybe we'll find one in another specimen.
It's possible. And even though the title of this paper and many of the write-ups on it were basically that ankylosaurs made bird-like sounds, I think that is way too far of a stretch to make from this paper. I don't think that's a fair assumption to make at all. Because, again, the larynx serves many purposes, and it's possible that the flexibility of the larynx in Pinacosaurus was mostly to close and keep food out or expand for better breathing. It didn't necessarily need to be at all related to vocalization. As Mark Witten pointed out on Twitter, the researchers showed that dinosaurs could have had a syrinx, but it's also possible it just had a larynx that couldn't make sounds. So in other words, the only thing they really showed is that the larynx couldn't make sounds. And so you could interpret that as, well, then it probably had a syrinx that was making the sounds. Or it could be something like a modern vulture that basically hisses because it doesn't have a syrinx. There's also a muscle attachment point which resembles an ostrich and another one that resembles an alligator. And neither of those have a syrinx. They boom and hiss and can't sing like a songbird.
So, okay, doesn't necessarily sound like a bird. Well, unless you talk about ostriches and emus and the booming, I guess. But it's not necessarily musical, but it could have made some kind of sound.
Probably. But even that isn't necessarily something you can assume from this. It's like the larynx just isn't like our larynx and some other animals that make the sound from the larynx. So it's more like eliminating types of sounds it could make with the larynx is really what they were able to do with this research.
Got it.
And then, of course, the tongue, mouth, and even the nose affect how animals sound, and we don't know those details of Pinacosaurus.
With a paper like this, where there's not too much research, like we've got a paper on what Parasaurolophus might have sounded like, and now we've got this paper, and there's just not too much on what dinosaurs sounded like. It's a lot of, I feel, foundational building kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. It's also like we just have the one so far. If you have more of them and you can kind of compare things or find hopefully more or less recent larynxes, then you can make some sort of analysis. But when you just have this one from the one ankylosaur and that's it, it's really hard to connect what it would have been like.
Better than none.
It's true. There might be a way to figure out the types of sounds that Pinacosaurus was capable of making. And that's because sounds animals make often align with the frequencies their ears are most sensitive to. That's how our hearing is. Our hearing is most sensitive to the sounds that are the range of human voice. And for the ankylosaur Struthiosaurus, that hearing range is about 300 hertz to 2160 hertz. In other words, we've said this before, it couldn't hear below middle C on a piano and couldn't hear the top 6 keys. Or put another way, its hearing matches the notes of a flute pretty well. Unfortunately, though, Struthiosaurus is a fairly distant relative to Pinacosaurus, so it's not going to be a very close approximation.
It's a starting point.
It is. And Struthiosaurus had a hearing range that's not too far out of the ordinary for a dinosaur, although it's a little more narrow, especially on the low end. So in the future, if we can find a syrinx or if we can find just more larynxes or something, and we can combine that with what they could hear, we might get a better idea of how they could vocalize.
I like it.
And I've got one more paper about ankylosaurs. This one's a pathology paper, but first we're going to pause for one quick sponsor break. Now switching from Pinacosaurus to Tarchia, I've got another ankylosaur paper.
We got an ankylosaur theme going.
We do. This paper was published by Tumanova and others in the Anatomical Record, and they were looking at Tarchia, like I said. It's another ankylosaurid with a club tail from Mongolia, similar to Pinacosaurus. Tarchia means the brainy one because it presumably had a bigger brain than its close relative Sicania. And Tarchia was probably a few million years more recent than Pinacosaurus, but it was probably similar in size to Pinacosaurus, although some estimates put it at much larger. More recent estimates have them about the same, though. Back in episode 215, Sabrina mentioned that a skull of Tarchia has what looks like Tarbosaurus tooth marks on it.
Oh, did they confirm it?
Sort of. It's always hard to confirm that sort of specific of a detail.
Oh, that's true. You don't know for sure it was Tarbosaurus.
Yeah. And certainly being bit by Tarbosaurus on the head would be a big problem. Even for something with an armored head. You know, Tarbosaurus is almost as fearsome as T-Rex. So, yeah, they had a very strong bite force and big, impressive teeth. The researchers didn't start out looking for a skull injury. They CT scanned Chamosaurus, Tarchia, and Sicania to look at their internal anatomy. And I should mention that they were looking at the holotype of Tarchia terese, which was described back in 1987. It's not a new specimen, therefore, but they didn't have a micro CT scanner available back when the holotype was described. So they're getting to it now to look at some of the details.
Makes sense.
And after scanning the Tarchia specimen, they quickly noticed that it had something different going on. One difference was that the airway looked different than its North American relatives like Euoplocephalus. In other words, Tarchia had a different trachea.
Oh.
Get it? Tarchia had a different trachea.
I got it.
But more interestingly, they discovered, quote, a huge unilateral osteoproliferative lesion within the airway ventrally, end quote. In other words, a large bony growth in the head below the brain, sort of in the path of air as it was breathing. It measures 80 millimeters wide by 57 millimeters high by 120 millimeters long, or about 3 by 2 by 5 inches, or in terms of items you might be familiar with, that's about 6 hot dogs arranged in a 2 by 3 stack.
It's a kind of random object.
But if you think about how like one hot dog piece can block our airway, this Tarchia had 6 hot dogs worth of mass in its trachea, or like in that sort of placement. Certainly not something you want.
No.
In the way. It wouldn't quite be as big as 6 hot dogs because it's sort of tadpole shaped, so the hot dogs would need to be sort of carved down on one end, but it would have obstructed almost as much air as like 6 hot dogs. Not good. There were also more than a dozen smaller growths in the sinuses. They were about 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter, about half an inch to an inch, and they probably were the result of an infection. Part of the reason they can tell that is because they were really concentrated in the left side, probably the left nostril, with only a couple on the right side of the head. So if you've ever had a sinus infection, you might know it's usually on one side of the head.
Very uncomfortable.
Yes. And so it looks like that was going on here. And the infection got so bad that it was causing bony growths to start popping up in the sinus. So there are 2 likely scenarios for how this Tarchia got an infection in its airway and in its sinus. One is that the Tarchia got a sinus infection just like we do by breathing in something. It infected the sinus, and then it just got really bad and eventually spread to the bone and eventually to block off that airway. The other option is that there was some kind of trauma that introduced an infection that eventually spread from the outer part of the head into the sinuses. So in other words, they can't tell specifically if the infection spread from the inside out or from the outside in. Inside out meaning from the sinus out.
Right. Either way, it ended badly.
Yes. The sinus infection, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. You know, we can get really bad sinus infections, and if let untreated, they can potentially kill you. So take care of yourself if you have a sinus infection. See a doctor. But for the trauma hypothesis, there are quite a few different ways that could have happened. There is a hole in the skull that's about 3.4 centimeters wide, which is comparable to a Tarbosaurus tooth. I think this is probably the specimen that you talked about with signs of a Tarbosaurus bite way back in the day. But it's also possible that that hole was the result of intraspecific combat, in other words, from another Tarchia. Not from tail bashing, even though they did have pretty good tail clubs. Instead, it might have been from locking horns like an antelope, because ankylosaurs, many of them did have big horns sticking out of the back of their heads, which would be kind of an awkward because they sort of have to get like past each other and then poke backwards towards each other and tilt their heads in order to be able to poke a hole in the spot. Doesn't seem the most likely, but it's one possibility. Another possibility is that it was from a claw. Could have been from something like a velociraptor, although velociraptor probably wasn't strong enough to puncture bone, as happened in this case.
Yeah. An ankylosaurid, too, would look too difficult to attack.
Yeah, it seems unlikely. They also mentioned that Therizinosaurus was around at that time, but, quote, seem an unlikely adversary for Tarchia, end quote.
Anytime we talk about Therizinosaurus, we talk about how it looks menacing, but it didn't really do anything menacing.
Yeah, and like you said recently in a different episode, their claws really weren't all that strong, especially for doing something like puncturing.
Oh, yeah.
So that does seem unlikely.
The claws could not handle the stress.
Yeah. It'd be really funny if it was something like an Alberta with those little chest claws and they were like specialized Tarchia skull puncturers.
Oh my gosh.
That's probably not the case, but it would be funny.
Like a tiny dinosaur going after and just bam, bam, bam.
Yeah, little assassin. Most likely, it seems like it's probably Tarbosaurus. There are also a couple of other indentations that seem to match up with the tooth pattern of Tarbosaurus, so that definitely seems like the strongest contender. If that was the cause of this infection, it would mean that Tarchia survived the initial fight only to succumb to the infection caused by that fight later.
Doesn't sound pleasant.
No. They described it as a chronic infectious sinusitis, which could have been bacterial or fungal. And for example, meningitis can cause, quote, intracranial abscesses, end quote, and sometimes bone growths as a result of that. So you could get all those little nodules like they had going down the one sinus as a result of a meningitis infection. But whatever the cause, as the authors put it, quote, these lesions were likely chronic, persisting for weeks to months, if not longer, and could have eventually proved fatal via meningeal or systemic sepsis, or by limiting this animal's ability to breathe or acquire sustenance, end quote.
That's intense.
Yeah, so it could have died directly from sepsis or some other infection problem, or it could have had a hard time breathing because it had that huge 6 hot dog pack stuck in its airway, or it's also hard to swallow when you have something that big in the back of your head. So it was in trouble one way or another. It wasn't going to survive that much longer.
Yeah, you don't want hot dog growths.
No.
We've got a few more news items, starting with Trinity the T-Rex was auctioned for $6.1 million US. That includes the fees because it sold for $5.3 million US before the fees.
Yeah, I don't know how we usually compare that if we're using pre or post fee money.
Yeah, I don't usually see it broken down, so I don't know. So this skeleton, it's 293 Trinity, and it's named because it's made of 3 T-Rex specimens that were found in Montana and Wyoming in the Hell Creek and Lance formations.
Oh, I never knew that.
Yeah, I didn't know before how it became named Trinity.
I knew it was made out of 3 specimens, and I knew it was named Trinity, but I had no idea that was why they did it.
Oh, it makes sense. So there's also 293 bones. That's why it's 293. And these were all found between 2008 and 2013. So more than half of Trinity is real fossils, just coming from 3 different individuals. The T-Rex was sold in Zurich, Switzerland, and it was bought by a private collector, so we don't know too much yet about where it'll end up, but you never know, could end up in a museum.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer that it was bought by a private collector and not a museum. Though that price, I feel like, is probably a lot lower than they were hoping for, because there was a recent one that was, like $30 million or something, not just a few years ago, and now it's all the way down to $5 million.
Yeah.
Could be a good thing if more museums can afford them.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, too, that it's 3 different individuals sort of Frankensteined together.
A composite.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Japan, Fukui Prefectural University is offering dinosaur studies. They're going to have new faculty that specializes in paleontology, geology, and paleoclimatology. The plan is to train researchers, geological and civil engineers, and experts in other industries like tourism, policymaking, education, IT, construction, reporting, and more.
There's a lot of fields.
Yeah, well, dinosaurs, we always say, gateway to science. You can connect it to anything, so it makes sense. The classes they're planning to start in spring of 2025 for 30 students per year. And the students will take classes on a new campus that's going to be developed near Fukui Prefectural Dinosaur Museum.
That is a really great museum.
One last news item. There is a family-friendly dinosaur movie, The Adventures of Jurassic Pet 2, The Lost Secret, that is going to be released in the UK on digital May 8th, so that's coming up. It's already on DVD, or you can stream it in the US. And based on the trailer, I've only seen the trailer, it seems like one of those feel-good movies. The title did sound vaguely familiar to me, and I looked it up. The first movie was from 2019. It's possible we mentioned it on the show.
I feel like we probably did.
Yeah. The premise is that Wendy and her grandmother, they protect this magical portal to a land of dinosaurs. The portal only opens once a month. And while they're visiting, there's this other kid, Curtis, who follows Wendy and her grandmother, and they see the dinosaurs. And these dinosaurs are all very friendly, even the tyrannosaurs.
Well, that's convenient.
Yes. One baby tyrannosaur, which is named Junior, follows them home, unbeknownst to them. So they have to keep Junior safe until the portal opens again in a month.
Oh, that's kind of a clever way to deal with. They don't have to have this dinosaur around forever.
Yeah. And have to get the dinosaur home to its parents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the meantime, there's some evil crime ring that the kids and Junior have to take down. But I mostly was paying attention to the dinosaurs in the trailer, so.
The crime ring looked like, it reminded me of like Spy Kids or something.
Or maybe Home Alone.
Yeah, but sort of a pretty slapsticky kind of villain situation.
That's what I'm saying. But based on this trailer, it's like a feel-good movie. So something to watch.
And as promised, we have a dinosaur connection challenge on dinosaur jewelry. This is a special connection challenge because it is brought to you by our new sponsor, Exquisite Eons.
Yes, which we'll talk about them more later.
But they make their own dinosaur jewelry.
Yes.
Sabrina, when do you think the first dinosaur jewelry was made?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like this is a trick question.
It might be.
Okay, and we're definitely talking about humans?
Maybe.
Oh, found the trick. Okay, what would have made jewelry, though? I'm thinking birds. Am I going off track here?
I will tell you it's not birds. I did try to see if a dinosaur has ever made jewelry as a starting point, and I couldn't find any examples of birds making jewelry. So it is made by hominids.
Oh, okay. Should have known. I'm just so Homo sapien-centric.
So maybe, I mean, technically they might be humans. I don't really know the definition of human and where the blurry edges are.
Sure. Okay, well, some sort of hominid that's not a Homo sapien, that means hundreds of thousands of years ago, probably.
That is the right range. So it is much, much older than I expected. The very oldest non-dinosaur, just like jewelry period that's ever been made that we found is between 142,000 and 150,000 years old.
Wow.
They are beads that are made from snail shells found in Morocco. They were just discovered within the last 10 years. Although there are other really old examples of jewelry as well.
Mm-hmm.
The first dinosaur jewelry is only about 10 to 20,000 years more recent than that first ever known jewelry, making it roughly 130,000 years ago and from Croatia.
Interesting. If you find fossils, I could see them being great items to wear.
Yes, these were not fossils, though.
Oh, okay.
I should also mention they're also the oldest jewelry that's known from Europe, since they're from Croatia, but they weren't worn by humans, which could also easily be a fun fact. The first dinosaur jewelry wasn't worn by humans. They are white-tailed eagle talons that were worn by Neanderthals, and white-tailed eagles are the largest predatory birds in Europe. They have a wingspan between about 1.8 meters to 2.5 meters, or 6 to 8 feet.
Wow.
Which makes it a contender for the largest wingspan of any non-extinct eagle.
At first, I was thinking that's an impressive wingspan, but I have recently been researching Quetzalcoatlus for I Know Paleo, our bonus episode. So I've had a second there. I was like, wow. And then I remembered and I thought, nah, never mind.
But think about it compared to humans, because they're the ones interacting with it. It is
that's
huge.
Fair.
They also often weigh over 5 kilograms or 10 pounds, which is very heavy for a bird. And the most relevant detail is that they have huge talons. Their hallux claw alone can reach nearly 5 centimeters or 2 inches long.
Ooh, yeah, watch out.
That's about the length of the average human thumb. So if you imagine instead of having a thumb, you had a claw that was the same length. That's what they have going on. But back to the Neanderthals in Croatia, the researchers found a set of 8 talons from a minimum of 3 different eagles, which means that the talons were collected by the Neanderthals and then assembled into a set from different species. I guess it's just like that T-Rex specimen you were talking about, at least 3 different individuals.
There you go.
From Radovic et al. In PLOS One, they said, quote, "We suspect that the collection of talons from at least 3 different white-tailed eagles mitigates against recovering carcasses in the field, but more likely represents evidence for live capture," end quote.
Okay, because it's 3 different individuals. It wasn't just we found these. It was we cultivated this.
Yeah, well, they had to capture them. They don't think that they just stumbled onto them in the field.
Yeah.
And, like in a field, not the field, and happened to find a whole bunch of dead eagles. They figure they had to actually capture them, which means these Neanderthals had to capture the largest eagle alive that they could find, basically with their bare hands, which is just quite an impressive accomplishment.
Yeah. Dealing with those claws.
Yes, because I'm sure they weren't happy to be caught.
Mm-hmm.
And you could imagine why, after achieving this impressive accomplishment of capturing the largest eagle that anybody around you has seen, you might want to have a token of that achievement to display on your body. And the researchers believe that the talons were removed from the eagles and then worn in a necklace or bracelet. They have some really good evidence for this. First, all 8 of the talons are at least partially polished. 4 of the talons also have cut marks that were smoothed over later, and they have cut marks that line up nicely in a very similar way to other bracelets and necklaces, which were confirmed to be bound together.
So the cuts were to create the bracelet or necklace, and then they smoothed it over after.
Yeah, and some of the cut marks were, they think, to separate the talon from the tendons on the eagle foot. So lots of cuts, but they polished them all up to make it nicer, and then also to connect it to a necklace or bracelet.
Mm-hmm.
So we often use the fact that birds are dinosaurs to connect subjects to dinosaurs, but in this case, I think it's especially relevant because the large eagle talons are very similar to the killing claws on a velociraptor or other predatory non-avian dinosaurs. And I've seen people wear replica velociraptor claws as a necklace before. I guess just everyone wants to be connected to dinosaurs, and wearing their killing claws as jewelry seems to be a very natural way to do it that people came up with 130,000 years before we even knew what dinosaurs were.
Yeah.
So jumping way ahead to Victorian-era England, roughly 130,000 years because it's a rounding error at that point.
Yep. It's practically modern day.
It is. So at that point, On the Origin of Species was published by Charles Darwin. The British Empire had colonies all over the world with many beautiful exotic birds, and the science of taxidermy had gotten more advanced and much more popular, including using arsenic powder to prevent decay and keep things looking new, which is not recommended, not a modern strategy.
I was about to say, we generally stay away from arsenic.
I found an example of a piece of taxidermied Victorian dinosaur / bird, and one of the first things they did was test it for arsenic powder to make sure, they knew how to handle it properly. And they're like, yep, there's a bunch of arsenic on this. So some Victorians wore entire taxidermy birds in their hats or on their clothing.
Oh, that must not have been good for their health with
if
the arsenic.
Covered in arsenic, no, it's not ideal. But there was also a trend of wearing taxidermy hummingbirds, just their heads actually, on jewelry.
Interesting.
It was seen as both a way to be hip with the new science of the day while also showing off a unique piece that no one else had.
No one head is alike.
Exactly. And who doesn't want to embody massive scientific advancements while looking stylish?
Sure.
And this leads us back to the sponsor of this segment, Exquisite Eons. They make jewelry by hand out of sterling silver using the lost wax method.
Oh, yeah. I loved learning about this method.
It's so cool. I watched like 10 YouTube videos on it. So the history of lost wax casting goes back about 6,500 years. The basic principle is that molten metal can melt away or burn off wax or a similar substance in a mold and then replace it virtually exactly in the same place. So you can make a model out of wax, put some plaster around it, and then pour molten metal in the top, make the wax go away, and replace it with that silver or whatever else you want. The really cool thing about this is very similar to how a lot of dinosaur fossils form. For example, when dinosaur bones decompose in Lightning Ridge, Australia, and then just the right mixture of water and other elements fill the space, you end up with an opalized dinosaur bone.
Yeah, those are pretty, but isn't that kind of how all fossils are made?
They are all water interacting with the bone, but in this case, it's like completely replacing the space that was left by a bone, whereas some are like actually the original bone, which has changed chemically.
Got it.
I think of that Australian opal now as like a lost bone instead of lost wax casting. That's just happening in nature over billions of years. Another name for lost wax casting is precision casting, and it allows for some really beautiful detail. Exquisite Eons uses that high detail to great effect.
Oh, yeah. Some really beautiful details on their pieces.
Yeah, like the skin on the brooches and the desk ornaments have a scaly texture to them. And the sterling silver also tarnishes black, which leaves a really cool emphasis around the scales when you polish the top of them. It sort of leaves like these cool little lines around the scales. It's really cool looking. The Triceratops they sent us has its horns polished too, which makes them look extra showy, as they should for a display structure on a dinosaur.
Show off those horns.
And it also has an open mouth so you can see the details of its beak. They also make a Stegosaurus, Pteranodon, and T-Rex. And the T-Rex even has a tongue sculpted inside its wide open roaring mouth, which is really cool.
Yeah, those are some fine details.
They are. Exquisite Eons also supports scientific research by donating a portion of the proceeds of every sale to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is better than the hummingbird heads that showed an appreciation for science, but weren't the best for the environment.
Or the hummingbirds.
It was not, no. I really want to thank Exquisite Eons for sponsoring this Dinosaur Connection Challenge. They really know their stuff. They clued us into both the Neanderthal eagle claw jewelry and the hummingbird head jewelry. And again, a huge thank you to them for sponsoring the segment and helping promote science with AAAS, as well as our humble dinosaur podcast.
Yes, thank you. You can go there and check out some modern dinosaur jewelry.
And in just a moment, we'll get on to our dinosaur of the day, Saurolophus. But first, we're going to pause for one last sponsor break.
And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Saurolophus, which was a request from PaleoMike716 via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was a Hadrosaurid that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Alberta, Canada, and Mongolia, in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation and Nemegt Formations, where it's been found. And it's two different species. It's one of the few dinosaurs known from more than one continent. It looks similar to Parasaurolophus, with the bulky body. It could walk on all fours, and it had a long horse-shaped head and a long tail, but the crest was different. The crest was smaller and spike-like, and it curved upwards at the back. And it goes up and back at about a 45-degree angle and then sticks out behind the skull.
Yeah, it's kind of typical of the Lambeosaurians. Most of their head crests kind of go up. Parasaurolophus is kind of a weird one where it actually kind of goes down at the back.
Yeah. Now, the crest is mostly solid, but it had a hollow base where it attached to the skull. And the crest is made of its nasal bones. The longest skull bones in Saurolophus are the nasal bones.
Also known as the premaxilla.
Mm-hmm.
Which is sort of the top front of the beak, too. So it's almost like the beak growing all the way back over the back of the head. Like sometimes I imagine them like slicking back their hair, but like maybe like a mustache going all the way back.
That's an interesting way of thinking of it. The crest also grew as it aged, which makes sense. Based on its scleral rings that have been found, Saurolophus may have been cathameral, so active throughout the day for short periods of time. It was also herbivorous, and it could walk on all fours or on two legs. It had a horseshoe-shaped lower jaw that wrapped around the toothless parts of the jaw to form a beak. And it cropped plants with its beak. It also had those dental batteries with hundreds of teeth, and those teeth were just being constantly replaced. So it could grind its food, almost like chewing. And it could eat food that was up to 13 feet or 4 meters above the ground.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. The type species is Saurolophus osborni, and the genus name means lizard crest. It was named by Barnum Brown in 1912. As I mentioned, there are two species. The second species is Saurolophus angustirostris. And that one was described in 1952 by Anatoly Rojdestvensky. Brown found the Saurolophus osborni fossils in 1911, and it was the first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton found in Canada at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, 3 Saurolophus osborni specimens have been found, including a virtually complete skull and skeleton. The holotype of Saurolophus osborni was mounted on a panel behind glass, and you can see the right side of the animal at the American Museum of Natural History, which we've seen that one.
Is it one of the ones that's sort of mounted vertically?
Vertically?
Like on a wall, basically?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and behind glass.
I feel like it's near the ankylosaurus, and that's why I might remember it.
I don't remember where exactly it was, but I was looking at pictures.
I mean, it's an ornithischian, so it's probably near it, because they have like the Hall of Ornithischians and the Hall of Saurischians.
For the other species, the Russian paleontological expedition went to the Gobi Desert in 1947, and that was led by I.A. Efremov, and they found a hadrosaur bone bed, and later they said that this was Saurolophus angustirostris. And that bone bed is known as Dragon's Tomb. There's so many well-preserved and articulated skeletons in Dragon's Tomb, which unfortunately has made it a favorite spot for poachers. Saurolophus is about 20% of the fossils found in the Nemegt Formation.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
I had no idea it was that many.
I didn't either until I started researching this dinosaur.
I never think of hadrosaurs in the Nemegt Formation.
Yeah, me either.
There's so many other dinosaurs. I think of ankylosaurs, little alvarezsaurs.
Ornithomimosaurs, and sauropods. I think of the sauropods.
There's also Therizinosaurus, troodontids, there's allosaurs, but I've never thought of hadrosaurs there. Although looking it up, there are multiple.
Yeah. So there's at least 15 specimens known for Saurolophus angustirostris. In 1930, Ryabanin named a third species, Saurolophus christavofici. That's my best guess at how that's pronounced, but that's no longer considered to be valid. It was based on part of a hip that was found from Heilongjiang province, China, but it's too fragmentary, and it had been compared to an isolated but complete ischium that was later found to be Hippacrosaurus. So that's why it's not considered valid. Also in 2013, Albert Prieto Marquez and Jonathan Wagner named Saurolophus morrisi, but that's now considered to be Augustinolophus, which is the state dinosaur of California. So we've talked about that one a lot.
That points out something important because that's a different Saurolophus species which got split out into its own genus. And when you were saying how this Saurolophus is on multiple continents, but they're different species, that could always happen. They could always say the Saurolophus that's in Asia is different than the one that's in North America, and then they'd have different genus names again, like happened to Augustinolophus.
Yes. But for now, it's the same genus and then 2 different species.
It would be unfortunate for California if Augustinolophus went back to Saurolophus, since it's been named the state dinosaur. Then our state dinosaur would just be Saurolophus, which would seem not that impressive.
Yeah.
Or at least unique. It's a cool dinosaur, though.
I don't think it'll go back, but only time will tell for sure. Now, Brown thought when he was describing Saurolophus, he thought that Saurolophus and Trachodon were similar and related. And he also compared the crest of Saurolophus to that of a chameleon's. He thought it'd be a good spot where muscles attached and then connected to a frill in the back of the head like a basilisk lizard.
Oh, that's a fun idea. Also sort of like the Dilophosaurus in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Because they have that kind of frill that like shoots out of their neck. Parasaurolophus having a huge one attached to its crest.
Yeah.
Or Saurolophus having a huge one attached to its crest would be really interesting.
Brown said the crest is, quote, the most characteristic and striking feature of the skull.
That's for sure.
Peter Dodson thought the crest was used for identifying if the animal was male or female.
Could be.
Could be. There's a lot of theories on the crest. In 1981, Marianska and Osmolska suggested the crest was used for thermoregulation. James Hobson thought that the crest was for display and suggested that there were inflatable skin flaps over the nostrils as well.
So could be frill on the back, inflatable nostrils, sacs on the front.
Yep.
All of the above. Animals like turkeys and stuff have all sorts of ornamentation around their heads. So why not both?
It's something that's really hard to decipher.
For sure, display had to be a factor, even if it wasn't the primary reason. When you got something that big on the top of the head, it's got to be used for display a little bit.
Probably. So like I said, there's now 2 valid species of Saurolophus, osborni and Angustirostris. Both species have the same head crests and a lot of other similarities. So in the past, scientists questioned if both species were valid, kind of going the other way from what you were saying, Garrett.
That would be more lumping, making
Yeah.
them the same species even and same genus rather than different genus.
Yes. But then in 2011, Phil Bell redescribed both species in 2 different papers, and he found them to be both distinct and valid, and said that each of them had their unique characters, and these unique characters weren't just due to individual variation. So it's not just different individuals look a little bit different. These are features known for these species.
It'd be remarkable if in the late Cretaceous you had animals in Asia and North America that were the same exact species.
Yeah.
Unless they could swim across the Pacific.
Oh, that's such a long swim.
Or I guess the Atlantic and walk through Europe.
So there are some differences. There's differences in the size. Like Saurolophus osborni was estimated to be about 27 to 28 feet or 8.2 to 8.5 meters long and weigh about 3 tons, with a skull that was about 3.3 feet or 1 meter long. Saurolophus angustirostris is estimated to be up to 43 feet or 13 meters long and possibly even bigger and weigh up to 11 tons.
Wow, that's a really big size difference.
Yeah.
But by weight, that's like almost 4 times the size.
It also had a 20% longer skull than osborni, and the front of its snout went more upward than Saurolophus osborni. The largest known Saurolophus angustirostris skull is about 4 feet or 1.2 meters long.
That's really big, especially considering it had a smaller crest than Parasaurolophus.
Yeah. They also found differences in the details of the skull between the 2 species. It's unclear which species came first. So yeah, did they start in Asia or did they start in North America? We don't know. In 2012, Phil Bell studied the skin impressions of both species, which were found on multiple individuals. There's skin from the face of Saurolophus osborni that's known from a single fragment from a right dentary in the lower jaw. There was no skin found on a Saurolophus osborni forelimb, but, quote, the entire forelimb of Saurolophus angustirostris is covered in a uniform arrangement of 1 to 2 millimeter wide pebbles, even in relatively large individuals, end quote.
Those are small scales.
Yeah. There was skin also found in the pelvic region of Saurolophus angustirostris, a small patch on a subadult, and skin found on part of the foot of a Saurolophus osborni. There's been skin found on the hind limb of Saurolophus angustirostris that was found in adults and subadults. And there were at least 2 patches of faintly preserved skin found on a juvenile Saurolophus angustirostris.
No shortage of skin information on this one.
Yeah. He also talked about patches of miscellaneous skin, and it's miscellaneous because unclear where on the body the skin came from. So there were a lot of scales that have been found, including polygonal, which range from 4 to 6-sided. There's pebbly scales that are small and rounded, shell scales that are asymmetrical and somewhat trapezoidal in shape, and irregular scales where there's no obvious geometrical sides, as well as shield scales that are circular and are typically flat or domed. So Bell found differences in the patterns and shapes of the scales, enough to differentiate between the 2 species.
Oh, wow. That's the first dinosaur I've heard of where scales are used to differentiate different dinosaurs.
Yeah.
For one thing, we rarely find any scales, and for another thing, they're not usually that different.
Yeah, exactly. But with hadrosaurs, a lot of skin's been found for hadrosaurs.
That's true.
Skin was also found on the tails for both species, and there were a lot of differences in the tail scales. For example, on Saurolophus osborni, the tail scales were more clustered, and it may have had a more spotted coloration. And on Saurolophus angustirostris, the scales on the tail made vertical patterns, and that may mean it had striped colors on its tail.
I've never heard that either. The patterns of the scales themselves might show the pattern of the coloration. That's really cool.
It is. In 2018, Phil Bell and others studied the sedimentology and taphonomy of Dragon's Tomb. Phil Bell did a lot of work on Saurolophus. Ivan A. Efremov's team found 7 hadrosaurid skeletons lying close together when it was discovered. And it was discovered in 1948 by Pronin. They collected at least 4 skeletons or parts of 4 skeletons, but it was really hard to transport them. They had to transport them by camel because they couldn't get vehicles to the site. There's been a lot of expeditions to this site. And Dragon's Tomb, like I said, it's a bone bed. It's mostly Saurolophus angustirostris, and they've got juveniles, subadults, and adults. There's one Tyrannosaur skeleton that was found that's probably Tarbosaurus. This bone bed was at least 21,500 square feet or 2,000 square meters, and there may have been over 100 Saurolophus skeletons in the bone bed. They estimated, the authors of the 2018 paper estimated the minimum number of Saurolophus individuals in the bone bed to be 21. And this could show gregarious or social behavior of Saurolophus angustirostris.
21 individuals is a lot.
Yes.
Although, I always have to caveat, just because they died together doesn't mean they lived together.
Yeah. At the very least, it is evidence of a catastrophic mass death. They were all killed and buried rapidly.
That's for sure. Otherwise, it wouldn't fossilize.
Yes. And based on the skeletons being well preserved and complete, it's likely this bone bed happened because of a flood or multiple floods that happened quickly in days to weeks in one year.
Although we did see that paper recently where they were showing how dinosaurs could be left out and have that thing where they get like pierced and then the fluids get drained out and all that, and then they could be preserved without being buried quickly.
That's true.
So that's always a possibility.
There's one left arm of a nearly complete Saurolophus angustirostris that had heavy damage from bite marks. The rest of the skeleton, though, was fine, so they think that a tyrannosaurid scavenged the arm, possibly Tarbosaurus.
Or one of the other tyrannosaurs that were around. There were a lot of meat-eating dinosaurs in that area.
In the paper, they said, quote, "Unfortunately, the reliability of this locality for yielding beautiful and complete specimens of Saurolophus angustirostris has made it a target of illegal fossil poachers, and in recent years, untold numbers of specimens have been illegally plundered and or destroyed."
Oh, that's a bummer.
Yes.
I was kind of hoping, since it's a hadrosaur and they're not as popular of a display piece as something like a tyrannosaur, maybe it wouldn't happen, but I guess...
It was in such good shape.
And they were really big.
Yeah. So the poaching, they figured out, started sometime after 2001. In 2015, Leonard Dewale and others described a small partial nest of Saurolophus angustirostris that probably came from the Dragon's Tomb in the Nemegt Formation. It's unclear where exactly these fossils came from because they were poached and then they ended up in Japan by way of a collector from Europe, and then it was donated to the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, which repatriated the fossils to Mongolia. And they're now at the Institute of Paleontology and Geology of the Mongolian Academy of Sciences.
Yeah, we see that a lot with poached things. Even if they get back in a museum, a lot of times that information about where they came from is lost, and they're not as useful scientifically, unfortunately.
Yeah, although this one's still very useful. In the paper, they said that there were 3, maybe 4 babies and 2 fragmentary eggshells in the block that they prepared.
Wow.
And these babies were considered to be perinates, they're just born, because the length of their skulls was less than 5% the length of the adult skulls. And their skull length's estimated to be about 2.3 inches or 6 centimeters long.
Oh, little cuties.
They didn't have nasal crests. It's possible they broke off, or maybe just the baby Saurolophus didn't form a crest yet.
Yeah, I mean, that's often proposed, that it might have been a display structure that only the adults grew. We see that in tons of animals.
In the paper, they were saying that the adult crests are so robust, it's unlikely that a crest broke off. They knew these babies were Saurolophus because the other skull bones were similar to those in an adult Saurolophus, and they had the upwardly directed snouts, like an adult. The eggshell fragments that were found look similar to other eggs associated with more basal hadrosauroids. The reason they think there's 3, maybe 4 individuals is based on the arm bones that they found. They said the babies were probably close to each other and nest-bound when they died. It's unclear if they had just hatched or were still in the eggs when they died, but they were dead and partly decomposed when they were buried by river sediment.
Yeah, that's what the perinate doesn't necessarily mean that they were hatched. They could have been just before hatching, too.
Exactly. There's a partially articulated skeleton there. That includes the skull, neck vertebrae, part of the tail, the right leg, and more. And then the rest of the bones are disarticulated, and that suggests that some of the perinates were more decomposed than others. They studied the sediments that were surrounding the fossils and found that they were buried by river sediment probably during the wet summer season, and they probably died within a relatively short interval. The fragile bones, they're really well preserved, and having a partially articulated skull shows that the bones weren't moved very far from before they were buried.
Yeah, that really sounds like the whole nest just got buried and fossilized.
Yeah. And again, they didn't have that spike-like crest, so it's likely that the crest grew as Saurolophus grew up. And then as it grew, Saurolophus, the snout also grew proportionally longer. In the media, Ducky from Land Before Time is probably a Saurolophus, though apparently there's some debate around this.
Ducky does have a cute little point at the back of her skull, so that makes sense.
Yeah. In the 1997 Land Before Time sing-along songs video, Ducky is a Saurolophus. And like you were saying, Ducky's head crest looks like the head crest of a Saurolophus.
I never put that together before. I always thought they were just giving it a cute little, cowlick, basically, the back of the head.
I think I knew, and then I saw a post recently saying Ducky's a Parasaurolophus, and in my brain, I was like, that doesn't make sense because of the crest.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ducky has been portrayed inconsistently in the series because, apparently the Land Before Time website, which no longer exists, called Ducky both Trachodon and Parasaurolophus, and in merch, Ducky's labeled as Parasaurolophus.
Yeah, but those are like a lot of times other companies or whatever that are just sort of hired to do a specific thing and that probably don't know all the lore of Land Before Time as well as the writers who are making the musicals.
I don't know, but I think this has sparked debate about it.
Yeah. You could make the argument, it's a Parasaurolophus and the crest just hasn't grown that much yet.
You could, but the way it is shaped.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. Yeah. I'm going with Saurolophus.
Well, as to where Saurolophus lived, in the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place as Saurolophus osborni included the ornithopods Hipparchosaurus and Parksosaurus, the ankylosaur Anodontosaurus, the pachycephalosaur Spherotholus, the Ornithomimus, the theropods Atrocioraptor and Albertonicus, and the larger theropod Tyrannosaurid Albertosaurus.
That's a lot of animals.
Yeah. In the Nemegt Formation with Saurolophus angusterostris, there were streams and rivers and shallow lakes, and other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place included the Hadrosaurid Barsbolia, the Pachycephalosaurs, Homalocephali and Prenocephali, the Ankylosaur Sicania, the Titanosaurs Nemetosaurus and Opisthocoelicaudia, the Alvarezsaur Mononicus, troodontids such as Xanabazar, oviraptorosaurs including Nemetomia, ornithomimosaurs like Gallimimus, theropods like Dinochirus and Therizinosaurus, and then the larger theropod Tyrannosaurid Tarbosaurus.
So many good dinosaurs in the Nemegt Formation.
Oh, yeah.
And Saurolophus is one of them.
Yeah. Well, no longer overlook it.
Try to remember that it's in that mix. But when Dinochirus and Therizinosaurus and Tarbosaurus, it's hard to stand out. And for our fun fact, I'm a little bit late, but I've got an Earth Day themed fun fact.
Better late than never.
I think so. The fact is that birds can recover very fast from near extinction.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, I agree. It is good. I think it also probably helped them to be the only group of dinosaurs that survived the asteroid impact.
Oh, yeah. The asteroid almost got them, but they bounced back quick enough.
They did. The reason we know that birds can recover very quickly from near extinction is because we've seen some incredible recoveries with conservation efforts of quite a few different bird species. Bald eagles are one huge success story, which we may have mentioned before. Their numbers in the US were at about 500,000 individuals 400 years ago, before the country of the United States was officially founded. But by the 1960s, the US was down to only about 500 breeding pairs of bald eagles.
Oh.
At that point, they were classified as an endangered species.
Well, they should be.
Yes. And endangered species is a term used in the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, also known as CITES. In the US, that treaty is known as the Endangered Species Act of 1973, but not too long after, just 34 years later, in 2007, there were well over 100,000 bald eagles, and they were classified as a species of least concern by CITES.
That sounds like the best you can do.
It is pretty remarkable, although not all that uncommon for birds, because according to the Center for Biological Diversity, 84% of bird species protected by the Endangered Species Act have increased or stabilized since being protected.
Good job, birds.
This comes from a publication by Kieran Suckling et al. In 2016 titled A Wild Success.
An apt title.
That's pretty good. In 2016, the average bird species had only been on the list for 36 years, which is an impressively quick recovery. The target was set at 63 years, and they were well on their way to many of these bird species being back to normal, essentially, after just 36 years. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do. The other 16% of that set of bird species declined since being protected, and the outcomes are much worse for sensitive species that aren't on the protected list and don't have those legal protections. But it's really nice to see that efforts to stop non-avian dinosaurs from going extinct have been working.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the non-avian dinosaurs did not survive that late Cretaceous extinction event, non-avian dinosaurs did thrive after a couple other extinction events in the Mesozoic, like the one that started the Triassic, as well as a couple of smaller extinction events along the way.
Yeah, they did well, although we kind of needed them to go away to make room for us, so.
Yeah. It's not the worst thing that went extinct. But I'm glad birds are around, and I'm glad that they can recover quickly because it's nice to be able to see them.
And that we can coexist alongside them.
Yeah.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we've got an interview with Dr. Brian Curtis, who has studied dinosaurs on 6 continents, so has a lot of excellent stories, as you might imagine. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.